Hello, and welcome once again to Family Historian. My name is Stephen Conti. Tonight, Family Historian is going down south, and we're going to learn about the wonderful genealogical record sources of the Palmetto State, South Carolina. And joining me on tonight's show, I am very honored to have as my guest a lovely lady. Her name is Janice Cross Gilliard. Janice has as many ancestors in South Carolina as South Carolina has palmetto trees. And on tonight's show, she's going to teach us how to do research in this wonderful state of South Carolina. Janice also, and I have to read her background here because it will take up 30 minutes of my show. She is a trustee of the Genealogical Society of New Jersey. She is the immediate past president of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society New Jersey chapter. I can't believe I said that in one sentence. And she is also a board member of the Genealogical Society, the National Genealogical Society, right, which is the whole state. Right. And tonight she's going to teach us about her home state of South Carolina. And now let's welcome Janice Cross Gilliard. Janice, welcome.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I know you live right here in Summit.
I do.
And you've been watching my show for years upon years.
Yes.
What took you so long to get here?
I know, right? And I've actually been watching the show before. I started watching it before I started doing my family history research. So that was kind of like the catalyst, along with the challenge for my husband, to start my own genealogical journey. So thank you so much for all of the amazing work that you've done.
I am very honored.
Mm-hmm.
I am very honored to have you here.
Thank you.
Anyway, let's talk about, whenever I do a show about a certain state,
yes,
I like to start with the history of that state. And South Carolina has a very interesting and very turbulent history,
right,
of course.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now, the first inhabitants of the territory that we call South Carolina,
right,
who were these people?
They were Native Americans, and there are a number of tribes, more than one. And it's important to honor that Native American history, that, you know, you're coming to discover something, but people were already there. So there were a number of tribes, over, I would say maybe 20 tribes.
Yes, and we do have a map showing
yes,
the South Carolina tribes.
Right.
Now, I know you yourself have Native American
I
roots,
do.
but not from South Carolina, but they wound up in South Carolina.
Right. So I discovered recently that several of my ancestors were from Rhode Island, and they were part of the Pokanoket Native American tribe, and also recently discovered that I have ancestors that are connected to the Cherokee tribe as well. Yes.
So you are the history of America.
I am actually a lot, and I try to encourage folks that the history of the United States is a shared history. It's
right,
just not one group. And so I have European, I have Native American, and I also have Black or African ancestry.
And you have embraced all of these ancestors.
Exactly, and I research all of that history as well. So it's a shared history.
Right. Now, we have a year here, I don't know if it's a good year, 1521.
Right.
The entrance of the Europeans, the Spaniards. They were the first, and they came into what is now
near Myrtle Beach, Winyah Bay, near Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, not far from there.
Which is near Myrtle Beach.
Myrtle Beach, South Carolina.
The famous resort area. Okay.
Yes.
And then in 1526, what happened in that year, 1526?
So then you have another group, because the first group wasn't necessarily successful. So another group came, another group of Europeans came in and settled because of the rice culture and fishing.
Right.
And they interacted with the Native Americans. And based on some of my research, actually took some of the Native Americans back with them.
Yes.
So that history goes way, way back. And it's a shared history between Europeans and Native Americans, taking people there, bringing people back, going to Africa and bringing folks over to cultivate rice. A lot of people didn't know how to cultivate the rice or how to cultivate indigo. And so they went to Africa and imported slaves because they knew how to do it. They didn't go and get folks that didn't know what they were doing.
Right, right. And so they really explored the interior of what is now the Carolina Territory.
Right.
Okay. 1670. We have the English coming in,
Right.
and they're the ones who named that territory. And
Correct.
can you tell us about that?
Yes, so it was named after King Charles, and it was called Carolus, I believe it is, which is, it eventually ended up naming it South Carolina, but I did some further research,
Yeah.
and South Carolina and everybody thinks that, oh, North Carolina's North Carolina, South Carolina, actually used to be one state.
Yes.
So you get two states out of that.
And what year did that split happen? In the early 1700s,
Correct.
I believe.
Yes, early 1700s.
And
a
so
lot of people don't know that.
Right. They named that area after King Charles the First.
Correct.
And that's the Latin form of
Right.
his name. Okay. Now we're going to skip ahead to 1776, the American Revolution.
Right.
And we have a man named John Rutledge, and I never knew this.
Right. So
Can
he was the first president of South Carolina.
Not governor.
Not governor, correct. And so and they fought, of course, against the British. Very, very interesting history. And again, that's a shared history. A lot of people think that only white people fought in the American Revolutionary War, excuse me, and that's not true. I have ancestors that are actually listed on the 1777 military census fighting in the American Revolutionary War.
So that makes you eligible for the Daughters of the American Revolution. Are you a member of that?
Not yet. I'm working on documenting his service.
Yes.
And we suspect that he may have fought in place of someone else. Because after the American Revolutionary War, you have him purchasing land. So where did he get the money from?
Right, right. Now, 1788 is the year that South Carolina, correct me if I'm wrong, joined the Union.
Correct.
And they became state number 8.
Yes.
The 8th state. Now, the Civil War, and unfortunately, South Carolina has always been a slave state, a rebel of a state. I believe it still is.
Very challenging.
I believe it still is.
History, but I love my state.
Right.
Love my home state, but very challenging history.
And we go back to Fort Sumter, which is off the coast of Charleston. I've never been to South Carolina, but I've been through South Carolina en route to Georgia. And my biggest regret is never going to that beguiling city of Charleston.
So next time you have to stop. And Charleston is a very, very beautiful city. I recently visited around Thanksgiving.
Yes.
They have a new museum there, African American International Museum. Very interesting history, especially with Fort Sumter.
Yes.
A lot of people don't know about Robert Smalls, who was enslaved, and he was a pilot or navigate a boat.
Yes.
And actually drove past, he's undercover, and took the ship that, he was enslaved, but he took the ship over to the Union side and freed his family along with himself and fought. Charleston's history of slavery is, of course, slavery is not a topic that most people are comfortable talking about. I have a lot of ancestors that come out of Charleston. I actually have a slave bill of sale for one of my ancestors that was sold out of Charleston for $325.
Yes.
We've come a long way, but a lot of people fought in the Civil War on the Confederate side, the Union side. I actually have documents of ancestors fighting in the Civil War.
Yes.
Which, when I started my journey, I never thought that I would find anything like that.
Right.
But,
So Fort Sumter was the beginning. It was attacked by the North.
correct.
And that prompted South Carolina in their rebel way to secede.
Yes.
And in what year did they say goodbye to the Union?
1860.
Okay.
And then after a while, and realizing that they weren't winning, they were admitted back, and that was in 1868, according to the records that I have. And there were conditions for that.
Right. They had their own conditions.
Yeah, just to say, okay, we admit that we need to come back, want to come back, and that they were fighting over. A lot of people like to say, "Oh, the Civil War wasn't about slavery. Oh, it was just about them maintaining their way of life," and that's not true. It was.
No.
They're maintaining their way of life was enslaving someone else,
And they were
which is not
threatened by
correct.
that.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Now, we gave you the history of the Palmetto State in about 5 minutes there, thanks to Janice. Let's talk about the how-to now, the how-to of doing South Carolina genealogy. And the first stop we're going to make are with the newer records, the vital records, which are located, which are centralized.
South Carolina, in Columbia, South Carolina.
Which is the capital.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And I just want to highlight, though,
yes,
that they do have, information is always changing in terms of researching and resources.
yeah,
But there are different regional locations within South Carolina. So they definitely want to go visit the website. And if there's a place that's closer to them. But most people, when they're in South Carolina, they go to the one in Columbia,
in
South Carolina.
Columbia. Okay, great. Now, we have some examples of the kinds of records that you will get: birth, marriage, and death. And there's a very important year, and we'll go over this very, very
Right.
quickly. 1915.
South Carolina was required, that's when they were required to start keeping vital records. So marriage, birth, and death. And a lot of people are frustrated when they start their research because
Yeah.
they're like, well, where are the records prior to that? So unless somebody was white, you may find records, a lot of records there. But for everybody, it started 1915.
1915. And we're going to show you a birth record right now. I
Yes,
believe it's
right.
one from your family.
Right, it's a birth record for my grandfather. And when you're doing research and you have a birth certificate, you want to research every name that's on that record because it may be connected to you in some way when the person is given the information
Right.
and research that. And then look for errors. If there are any errors, correct them. So for my grandfather, they had his name as Hoyt Cubitt Cross. His middle name was Hoyt Herbert Cross.
Right.
So if you find inconsistencies or information that's not correct, you want to definitely correct that along in your journey and as you're documenting information.
Very good. Now, a marriage record. We have a marriage
Yes,
record,
yes.
again, from your
So,
family.
yeah, so marriage records are very, very important, and most of them will have, the two folks that are getting married, their parents' information. In South Carolina, for some of the records, I've noticed that they only have the two people that are getting married and where they came from, or the county that they came
They
from.
don't
and
list
that's
a
it.
witness.
Right,
Witnesses.
not always. So
Right.
my point is that the records may vary depending on the time frame that you're looking at. But marriage records can yield vital information. If they have witnesses, you definitely want to research them because you never know if they're family or close friend. In most instances, I've found that it's a family member.
Right.
Very important.
And the last step that we take in life, the death record.
Yes, those records are very important, and want to stress again, look at every name that's on there, even to the person that's recording the death, and more important, the person that's providing the information. In most instances, the person that's providing the information is a relative. You definitely want to research them as well.
They call that the informant.
Exactly.
Okay.
And sometimes the information can be wrong in terms of the date of birth. I've seen inconsistencies many times, and typically it's 3 to 4 years off, but you always want to, when you're researching one record, you want to have at least 2 or 3 other records that confirm the information that you have. So you may see some fluctuations in the years.
Right. Now, you told me, every state is different.
Correct.
You have to
Yes.
use, if you're in New Jersey and doing research in South Carolina, you cannot use your New Jersey mind. Every
Right.
state is different.
Exactly.
Now, in Charleston, the gorgeous city of Charleston, the records go back to 1877.
Right. So it depends on the time frame that you're looking for, the location that you're looking at. Records may vary, but it's just important to research before you go to
Right.
South Carolina to see what's available. But some information, it does go back in terms of vital records. It can go back further. Also depends on the race of the person. So
Right. That's a horrible truth that we have
Right.
to face,
Yes.
unfortunately.
And I normally only say that so that expectation levels are set.
Right.
So if you're African American and you're researching, then you can pretty much count on 1915 as your starting point as far as records being available.
Now, in Columbia, which is the state capital, you have the state archives, which
Yes.
is, and you've been there a few
Yes.
times, a beautiful building.
It is, yes.
A very high-end kind of research center.
Yes.
Okay. And this is where you will get the historic records in the state archives in Columbia. Now, we all have a federal population census in our country, and the ones in South Carolina, 1790, which is heads of families, to
Exactly.
1950. That's the
Correct.
last one we have. And I think we have examples of some
Yes.
here.
Yes.
You have the 1870.
An example of 1870 census, correct. But we want to stress that each state may have their own state census records.
Right.
And I have an example here for my second great grandfather, Stuart Smith. He's listed on the 1869
Right.
state census record.
Now, that's 1 year before 1870.
Correct.
Now, in New Jersey, we have a state census, 1855 to 1915.
Correct.
But in South Carolina, you have something called a state and territorial
Census,
All right.
yes.
1753
Right.
to 1920.
And we've had the conversation where we want to stress that you want to prepare a research plan before you go
Right.
and check what records are available as far as the state census records. And I was surprised to find an 1869 record for my ancestor.
How does the state census vary from the federal population? Is there more information? Can you read the information
say
there?
that it is less. So it's giving his name. It's also giving, well, it's male, the sex. Also, if there are females in the home.
Right.
So for him, he's listing himself and his wife. He did not have any children at that time.
Now, you could not find him in the federal. Could you find him
Well,
in the
you
federal?
can find them, but you're starting with 1870. He was born in 1845. He was a person of color, so he didn't show up until 1870. One thing I want to correct is oftentimes in research, we're told that you won't find people of color before 1870. That's not correct. So I always encourage people to look at all of the census records, but in South Carolina, they do have state census records, territorial records, so you definitely want to look at those as well as agricultural records.
Because I was always told that the 1870 was the census record for the African American.
Well, I have to tell you, one of the census takers made a mistake, which is why I always say look at all of the census records, no matter what the methodology or the rules are, because one of the census takers made a mistake from a group of my ancestors on the 1860 slave schedule and listed all of their names. So if I followed the rule as an African American, started 1870, I wouldn't have looked at that. But I heard someone else say you should always look at all of the census records, and I've actually found ancestors. Everyone was not enslaved. A lot of people think that every person of color was enslaved. Everybody wasn't enslaved, and so there are census records that are free inhabitants. So you can find folks of color in South Carolina in the 1850 census, and they were free people of color, and especially in Charleston.
Isn't that something?
Yes.
See, there's always something else around the corner.
Absolutely.
And you as a professional genealogist, you never give up. There's always, you do that deep digging and you come up with something, which is wonderful.
And it's not overnight. You know, a lot of people watch Finding Your Roots or other shows and they think, oh, I can find my ancestry within 30 minutes. I will say it is much easier than when I started. Pretty much, if you have grandparents, great-grandparents, names of them, you can find information in like within an hour to kind of get you started. But I started when you started your show, and I did it the hard way initially. So things have become easier.
Great. I'm very proud of you.
Thank you, and I'm proud of you as well.
Okay, great. Now, I know we have the 1880, and you have an ancestor on the 1880 census, I believe.
Yes, and that information is very, very helpful. You see if they were still living in the same area, that question is asked, and it just helps you in terms of your research to look at every census record to follow their path.
Right. Now, other sources, you're a huge proponent on the local historical societies.
Yes.
And where are you from in South Carolina?
I am originally from a very, very small town called Mullen, South Carolina, in Marion County.
Okay.
Where you get Francis Marion, Swamp Fox from.
And you have used their historical society. I
Yes.
think your ancestors owned that town, right? Am I right on that?
Some of them. So here's the thing, right? So you can go to the archives in Columbia, you can go to, vital statistics and all, but you definitely want to visit the local historical societies or the local archives.
In other words, down-home research.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bible records. Is there a repository for Bible records?
So the local libraries, local historical societies, a lot of people donate their information. They don't want it just sitting around their, some people don't want it sitting around in their homes, and they will donate Bible records. So it's important to check with your local historical society in South Carolina or a local library, especially special collections, to see what they have available.
All right, and cemeteries. You use Find a Grave, and we have a photo of an ancestor's grave.
And so Find a Grave is really a great resource because all you do is enter the name, the location, and if they're buried in that state, you pretty much can find them. And then I was successful in finding
Yeah.
records. And I've driven actually by this place
Yes.
a
Yes.
number of times. So if you are stuck, Find a Grave can help you locate a cemetery in South Carolina. Make sure you go and visit it.
Right.
Information that you may not have in terms of, well, when were they born? When did they die? You
And
may be
who
able
is
to find it
buried
on the
here?
death record.
Who is this here?
This is my great-grandmother's sister's husband. We also have a death record for his son,
Yeah.
and then also his wife. And what I found very, very interesting is that the entire family, that immediate family,
Yes.
they were buried together, and they had these beautiful, beautiful
Yes.
headstones, which
Yes.
I thought was pretty interesting and spoke to their involvement in their community. A lot of them were teachers, educators, attended college, and so
All right.
forth.
And then I understand that the State Archive in Columbia has newspapers from 1792 to
Right.
1950.
A lot of them will have access to that or will allow you to use their computers. You can check out Chronicling America, which is free
Right.
through the National Archives, and you can get information that way. And what I try to stress is that not every location that you're going to may have access to every newspaper that was available, but some. And
Right.
so you may do a lot of research. It's important. You can do a lot of things online, but then some research you actually have to go to the location.
Yes. Now, you mentioned that you had an ancestor who was in the Civil War,
Yes.
an African American
yes.
ancestor, but he was on the southern side,
Yes,
the
he was on the Confederate side.
And you did
And-
some research on him, and I think you have something here.
Yes.
And what was his name, and what?
So
when did this happen?
I've seen different spellings for his name.
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
Or I believe it was actually Tracy
Yes.
Franklin. And he is listed as not fighting. He was on the Confederate side.
Okay.
But he was the cook for his enslaver.
And the enslaver
And
was fighting.
B.F. Davis, yeah, he was fighting on the Confederate side. So I was really surprised to see that.
Yeah.
Because in most instances, when you're talking about the Civil War and people of color, you're always thinking, oh, they were on the Union side. But some of them had no choice.
That's right.
So they were the cook or they fought in the place of their master. So I think we just have to be a little open-minded when we do our research. I
Right.
was a little surprised to see
Yeah,
that.
that's wonderful. Now, there are several how-to books on South Carolina genealogy, and we're going to highlight them right now. Is there a best how-to book on
So
South
there's a
Carolina?
gentleman, his name is Brent Holcomb,
Yeah.
and he wrote a guide on researching in South Carolina. And there are a number of resources that you can go online and type in South Carolina or the county that you're from and look at those resources because it kind of gives you a guide in terms of the families that were there.
Right.
Or how to or where to go because everything isn't necessarily, once again, online. So books are
Right.
very, very important.
Now, then we also have the South Carolina Genealogical Society.
Oh, yes, they are amazing. I haven't joined yet, but they offer a lot of conferences and they offer assistance, and you can look them up online as well or visit when you go to South Carolina.
Right. Before we close, I want you to tell our viewers about your northern roots in the Native American and how they wound up in South Carolina.
Okay, so I initially, when I started my family research, anyone that asks us would tell them, my family's from South Carolina, they're from South Carolina. And through DNA, I discovered that my family was not only from South Carolina, but actually out of Rhode Island and then into Massachusetts and Connecticut. And out of all of the children for my third great-grandfather, one of their children ended up in South Carolina. Before he ended up in South Carolina, he was in Washington, D.C. What is he doing in Washington, D.C.? After the Civil War, that's where he was. He started a school. And then he ended up in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. And that's where my great-grandfather comes in. And he was phenomenal. His name was Samuel G. Cross. And we actually have a connection to Summit because some of his descendants actually moved to Summit, New Jersey. So here it is. I've been living here for 35 years and have family here. Didn't know that I had family, and they all originate from Samuel G. Cross out of South Carolina.
And you had a very good friend. It was written up
Yes,
in
we
the
were
paper,
friends
I
for
think.
35 years.
Yeah.
Leslie Scott. And Leslie would always say, Janice, you know what? We're so close. We have to be related.
Yeah,
I'm like,
yeah.
I'm not finding that. And she passed away, unfortunately, in 2018. And after her death, about 6 months afterwards, I found out that we were actually cousins. And her great-grandfather and my great-grandfather were brothers. And both men descend from Samuel G. Cross. So how ironic is that,
Isn't
right?
that's a
Yes,
blessing. And
yes.
he was, so you have European blood as well.
I do. And most of that is, some of that is out of South Carolina. I've been able to make some of the connections there through DNA. But I try to focus, right now, I'm focusing on my cross ancestors and that story because it is an American, it's where that shared history I talked about before, where it ties in with that cross line, fighting the American Revolutionary War, fighting the Civil War. One record I'm kind of fleshing out for War of 1812. And so that's why I stress to everybody, we have more in common than
Yes.
not when it comes to history in
So
this
you are
country.
eligible for all of these hereditary
Yes,
societies.
yes. And I'm going to be working on that. I'm still kind of fleshing out because I want to write a book about my family history because I want all folks to know we all have a story to tell. And if it's not you, who's going to do it, right? So if I tell people all the time, if you're the only person in your family doing your family research, then you're the one that's called to do it. And I found some amazing information on my family, even out of Charleston, going back to Charleston. I have one ancestor, Benjamin McKnight Brawley, who was born in Charleston, wasn't enslaved, attended Bucknell University in Pennsylvania, was the first person of color to graduate, and just has a phenomenal history. So much information about him, starting universities, teaching, prominent in the Baptist community, just amazing information. His son, Benjamin Brawley, attended Harvard, taught at Morehouse, and just this phenomenal history. And I would constantly go back to my family going, you all didn't know about this, and no one knew. So I feel that my ancestors chose me to tell this story.
So you did the paper trail.
First, yes.
You did the paper trail. So this is what the difference is between, and you are both a family historian, but first the genealogist. We do the mechanics of it.
Right.
And then you put the meat on the bones.
Exactly. And methodology is important. But I tell folks, look at everything. The history of an area, especially South Carolina history, it's important. The laws of the area, it's important. The language at the time, it's important. And that helps you, when you go to do your family research, to understand the history, how the two are parallel and how your families fit in. And I tell the young people, especially at family reunions in my family, that when they're in history, and I've always loved history, pay attention.
Yes.
Because your ancestors were there.
That's right. Listen. We have to listen.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you miss South Carolina now that you're a New Jerseyan?
I'm a Jersey girl now.
Oh, you're
I love going back to visit, and my family, they're constantly, hey, are you coming back? Are you going to retire here? Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet.
You don't want to go to South Carolina and play golf.
Not yet, no.
I hear
especially with the heat.
Yeah, they have great golf courses down there.
Yes, they do, especially in Hilton Head. Yes.
Right. So South Carolina is a genealogy-friendly state, would you say?
It is. But make sure you have your research plan before you go. You don't want to walk into an archive center and say, figure this out for me. You should have done your homework already and say, this is what I'm looking for, this is what I need, and this is what I have a challenge with. And so I used to watch shows, and I've listened to your show, and they pull out the big books, and never thought I would find anything like that. But I've been able to go and find a ton of information, and most of the folks there have been very helpful towards me because I have my information, I know what I'm looking for, and I have a research plan.
And you have good organizational skills.
Yes, that's important.
Well, this has been a wonderful interview with a professional family historian and genealogist. What more do you want? Janice Cross Gilliard, I'm so proud of you. You are professional up to there. You know, you're magnificent.
Thank you for your inspiration, Stephen. Thank you.
Please, I blush when I hear that. You know, it's wonderful.
Really, we would sit and say he's on and watch your show. So thank you.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janice,
for
coming on my show.
Thank
It's about time.
you. Absolutely.
And on that note, as I say all the time, we are all descendants of ancient civilizations. Genealogy is your key to the history of your family. And so until next time, this is Stephen Conti wishing you the very best of luck in your research, and above all, happy ancestor hunting. Good night.